Hey there. So today we're going to continue section 7.2 and look at the remaining kind of global and local impacts of human activities. So if you remember where we're at, we are in section 7.2. This was our um, intro slide, for lack of a better word, and these were our objectives that we were looking at. So 7.1, the first part, 7.2, the first part, we looked at these two objectives here up at the top. So how human activities change the atmosphere and climate, and how changes in the atmosphere drive climate and other changes in global systems. Today we're going to look at land uses, land pollution, water quality, and those impacts that can have on ecosystems and our biosphere just in general. So the slide we left off on was actually this one with CFCs and stratospheric ozone. So we're going to move forward from that and look at something called biological magnification. So if you'll find your notes where you left off, you can either continue those or start over with section 7.2 and put down that heading that I just showed you. All right. So here is what we call biomagnification, biological magnification. Let me scoot my face over here a little bit. So when we talk about pollution in terms of how it impacts species and ecosystems and the biosphere as a whole, one of these things that we need to consider is what we call biomagnification or bioaccumulation. And this is this idea that toxins that we put into our environment actually take a toll on species differently based on where they're found in a food chain or food web. So meaning the trophic levels that they occupy. So if we have toxins of any sort, these could be medicines that somehow get into water ecosystems just based on leaching through waste facilities. This could be plastics, right? Plastics were something that were kind of a hot topic for a little while there in terms of microplastics and BPA and those types of toxins that we know we're using in manufacturing. If that type of not information, but those types of chemicals get into water ecosystems, they can accumulate in food chains. And really what they impact is not the ones at the bottom, but are going to be those kind of at the top of that food chain. So I failed to mention here, go ahead and get the definition there. And you're going to want to get these two here also. Okay, so kind of like yesterday, we've got a lot of information to get this time as well. So there are two different types of pollutants. There are water-soluble pollutants, and then there are fat-soluble pollutants. And the difference is water-soluble pollutants are excreted, which means they're removed from the body in the form of urine or sweat or saliva or something else. Okay, but it's going to be excreted and removed by the kidneys. Fat-soluble pollutants, unlike water-soluble pollutants, is these are going to remain in an organism's body fat. So this means that these are long-term. So they're going to have long-term impacts on those species that ingest or are exposed to these fat-soluble pollutants. In a food chain, those fat-soluble pollutants can increase as we go up our trophic levels. So this would be an example of what we've seen before, like an energy pyramid, where over time, energy is decreasing, right? It's getting smaller and smaller as you go up that food chain. Well, in this case, you can see the numbers here on the right are not decreasing. So what we see happening in ecosystems like this, again, for fat-soluble pollutants, is we have a water ecosystem where that pollutant is first going to be kind of suspended. The producers down here, my algae, my phytoplankton, will be directly exposed to whatever that fat-soluble pollutant is, and it gets stored in the body of those organisms, of those photoautotrophs, our producers. The primary consumer here, the zooplankton, is going to take up those fat-soluble pollutants as well because they're going to ingest the producer. And when they consume the producer, those fat-soluble pollutants are still present. And those fat-soluble pollutants then get transferred to the fatty tissues or whatever molecules it is that get stored in the zooplankton. As we move up our food chain and the small fish consume the zooplankton, those fat-soluble pollutants, again, are transferred, and now they're going to be stored in the tissues of the small fish. That it then gets transferred again to large fish. And then finally, we end up with our largest carnivores there up at the top, our fish-eating birds like eagles and hawks and herons and pelicans. Those are going to be the types of organisms that are going to be most impacted by this type of situation. Now, the other thing I want you to consider about this is that humans sit at the top of almost every food chain. So if humans are consuming large fish like salmon or eel or shark or any type of larger fish type species, you're going to see that accumulation of those toxins. It's possible that we are also going to be exposed to those same pollutants and toxins in our own bodies. So not only are we impacting the ecosystem, if we want to be super selfish about this, we're also potentially negatively impacting ourselves as well. Okay, so we see this with composition of things like mercuries and plastics and a toxin called DDT. And DDT was something that was brought up by an author named Rachel Carson a long, long time ago, specifically in regards to bird populations, because over time we were discovering that eagles specifically were having issues with reproducing because DDT, this toxin specifically, was weakening their shells. And so, as birds do, when they would lay their eggs and then sit on their eggs to kind of keep them warm, the shells would crack, and we were losing large numbers of eagles in terms of their population size. Again, strictly due to a fat soluble pollutant called DDT. Okay. I'm going to show you a video here for just a second. I think it's only about a minute long that we'll talk about, again, biomagnification, just in different terms, but with many of the same species that you see right here. So watch that, and then we'll come back and move forward. Okay.
Toxic substances, like the pesticide DDT, accumulate in the tissues of animals. This is called bioaccumulation. When DDT is sprayed on a marsh, its concentration in the water is very low. DDT is picked up by the plankton living in the marsh, and it accumulates in their tissues. Small fish that eat the plankton get a higher dose of DDT because of the accumulation resulting from eating many plankton during their lifespan. Larger fish that eat many smaller fish receive an even higher dose of DDT. Birds that eat fish, such as this heron, will receive a still higher dose because they eat many fish throughout their lives. This increased concentration of toxic substances in the bodies of animals higher on the food chain is called biological magnification or amplification. From the lowest trophic level, the plankton, to the highest trophic level, the birds, the concentration of DDT in body tissues may increase by a factor of over 100,000. As a result, the populations of several predatory bird species have drastically declined.
Okay, so moving on from that, when we look at pollution, again, it's not just going to be these fat-soluble or water-soluble pollutants that we need to be concerned with. There are also other issues. And so on this slide, what we're looking at is a different process called eutrophication. So we know that, again, you don't need to write that top heading because I believe we already got that on the last slide. But eutrophication is a different type of consequence of water and land pollution. So this is specific to farms and runoff from cities, but farming is generally where we're going to see this occurring the most. So when we have farms and crops that we're trying to grow, we know that farmers like to use fertilizers, and fertilizers, as we talked about back in chapter 4 with our nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, fertilizers contain lots of nitrogen and phosphorus. And that nitrogen and phosphorus is really important for plant growth. In general, the more nitrogen, the more phosphorus you get, the more plants you're going to get. So we tend to kind of sometimes overuse fertilizers on croplands and on farms in an effort to produce greater yields, greater product, more money for the farmer, right? The problem that we have with this is if we're not using fertilizers in a conscientious way, where that nitrogen and phosphorus runs off due to like a strong rainfall, or over time it just kind of washes off and out of the soil, well, it'll then wash into rivers and creeks and other waterways that eventually lead to larger bodies of water like here. So the picture that you're looking at here is of the Gulf of Mexico. They're seeing, you've got Louisiana down here, and you have parts of Florida over here. And the stuff that you see off the surface, the greenish kind of color, this is not land and this is not plants. This is all algae that's now growing in the surface of that body of water. And that algae is there because we know we have a really big river system that drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. And that river system is called the Mississippi River. Mississippi River, we know, is going to drain down from those Midwestern states, from Illinois and Indiana and Ohio, even all of the Tennessee River, right, is going to flow into the Mississippi. And then you've got the plain states like Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas. All of that drains into the Mississippi River. And if you know anything about farming, those are big, big farming states. So where we're growing lots of crops, we have lots of fertilizer use, and that fertilizer use will wash into these water ecosystems, draining out into, the Gulf of Mexico. And as a result of that, we get this algae overgrowth, because algae, similar to plants, the more nitrogen, the more phosphorus, the more growth you get with algae. Now, there is a downside to this, because in general, the production of algae, though it's a producer, you assume this is going to be a good thing. It can lead to all sorts of other issues in these ecosystems, where it's covering the surface of the water that leads to a decline in plant populations of things like seaweed and kelp underneath. And over time, the fish and other animals that are living in those ecosystems that are not producers can essentially be smothered by the production of this algae. We see this a lot of times along coastlines and in rivers where we have lots of fertilizer use. So I'm going to show you a little video here that's going to walk you through exactly what that process looks like for eutrophication. And it may be helpful to jot down kind of the steps in terms of exactly, okay, this happens first when water washes into an ecosystem, which leads to this, which leads to this. And if we've got questions about that, we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. Or we may even do an assignment with eutrophication here to help kind of drive that home, because it is kind of a complicated process. But it is important, again, to kind of understand exactly the sequence of steps that occurs. All right. So watch the video, replay it if necessary, and pause it to get those steps jotted down, and then we'll come back here.
Eutrophication is a process that can happen in a water body, like a river or lake, when too many nutrients are added to the system. Eutrophication starts when fertilizers, which are rich in nutrients like nitrate and phosphate, are washed into the river or lake system. This leads to an increase in nutrient concentrations in the water. The nutrients are food for algae, and the algae grow and reproduce quickly, forming a thick green bloom in the water. This algal bloom will absorb sunlight shining on the water, so the sunlight can't reach the bottom. Plants who need this light to photosynthesize will die. The algae will also start to die when they eat up all of the nutrients and run out of food. Next, bacteria start to break down the dead plants and algae, and that releases more nutrients back into the water, continuing the algal bloom cycle. The bacteria, with a continuing supply of food, reproduce into much larger numbers, consuming oxygen as they grow and respire. There's not much oxygen in the water to begin with, so when the bacteria consume it quickly, it might run out completely. Water without oxygen is called anoxic. If the water turns anoxic, all non-bacterial life in the water, including fish and other animals, will die. So, eutrophication happens when nutrients are added to water, which causes an algal bloom, cutting off sunlight and feeding bacteria. The bacteria use up oxygen in the water, which becomes anoxic, causing everything living in the water to die. Eutrophication is one reason why we need to be careful with fertilizers when we're growing crops.
All right, so that was eutrophication. And again, like I said, we'll try and do something to kind of reinforce that whole process. And actually, I believe one of the gizmos you'll be looking at later on this week will address some of that concept with you at that point. Okay, so if we look at some other impacts, other human impacts on land and water ecosystems, if we look at land use specifically, you can compare these two charts. I like these two diagrams. You can see how different this has become. In 1620, 3 centuries ago, from 1920, even now 4 centuries ago, right? We had all this forested land. And now in 1920, 300 years later, you can see exactly what the human population's done. Now, obviously that's to be expected as our population has grown in size. We need more places to live. We're maintaining some of the forest areas in these specific protected areas. But in large part, these forest ecosystems have gone away, which leads to a lot of issues, right? Healthy forests, we know, protect fresh water. They absorb CO2. They help to moderate climate and large-scale changes in climate. And so when we cut down our forests, we can have negative effects not only on the quality of our soil, but also on the ability of our ecosystems to absorb and kind of rid our atmosphere of CO2 and also moderate climate. So we do get climate changes, large-scale climate changes, as kind of an indirect effect of deforestation and cutting down some of these larger forested areas. Okay, so that can certainly be a negative thing in terms of human population growth and our impacts on our ecosystems. This is another type of negative impact that we see with human population growth and kind of our practices so far. So there's I guess a type of practice that has happened, which is called monoculturing. Mono, if you remember in Latin, means single or one. So the idea behind a monoculture is that you're essentially wiping out genetic variation, and you're simply producing the same thing year after year after year. So you don't have a lot of variety in the crops that you're producing. You're not kind of turning over the soil and giving it, years off where it can kind of regenerate and become more healthy over that period of time. You're simply planting large swaths of farmland with the exact same crop year after year. And the risk with that is that we're essentially kind of dumbing down our farming practices, right? We're not having lots of variation. So if something were to happen that threatens that one crop that's planted year after year after year, you run out of really that resource. It has the potential to go extinct. In addition to that, you're also threatening kind of the quality of the soil. So planting the same thing over and over again is not generally ideal for any farmer, but cost effectively, it may produce greater yields in the short term. But again, if you're decreasing the quality of the soil over time, your yields also decrease. So you have to supplement with extra things like more fertilizer, which, as we saw, is not always the most beneficial thing to be doing. Okay, so that's crop monoculture, which is also kind of a negative side effect of all of this. Development of urbanization, and of course, obviously, as we're building cities and our population is growing in size, urbanization is going to be something that is a continuous kind of process. So we have more and more individuals that are moving to cities and suburban areas. As a result of that, you get large amounts of waste that are going to be produced. And if we don't dispose of them properly, then you have the additional issues with, again, water quality, air quality, soil quality, because all that waste has to go somewhere. And if we can't get rid of it in an efficient way, it's just going to multiply and continue to be there. Okay, so those are all going to be issues. And these are things that I think we're all mostly familiar with. So I don't have anything here that I'm going to ask you to write down. But if there's something here that you think would be helpful, then certainly jot it down. Last couple slides for this part. So we have habitat loss, which is exactly what it sounds like. This is something that happens when we destroy a habitat of any sort. As a result of that, we get species that once occupy that area that either have to leave and find a new area to live, or they run the risk of going extinct. What you're looking at here in this image is more of this idea of habitat fragmentation, where we're cutting down a habitat and restructuring a habitat in such a way that we have these isolated pockets where some species are still able to survive, but a majority of them aren't able to occupy kind of their same range. So we have like these bits and pieces of a habitat that are maintained, but there's no real way to get from one to the other. It's almost like they're on islands. So this is an example of what looks like we had a forest here at one point that was cut down to maybe create farmland of some sort. Or perhaps this is a forest that's been replanted since something was once there. But you can see kind of the way that this is structured. I mean, we all know plants don't grow like this with these nice clean cuts, right? So obviously something changed to kind of alter that ecosystem in a way, leading to habitat fragmentation. Restoration is the positive side of these things. So if we cut down forests, if we have habitat loss, if we have fragmentation, restoration is the process where we recreate conditions that help to kind of reestablish an ecosystem in a way that's similar to maybe secondary succession, but this is specific to humans purposefully doing this. So we're restoring habitats in a way, and there are lots of examples of where we're doing this as part of our conservation efforts. But again, the issue with this, even though it's well-intentioned, is that you may not end up with an ecosystem that looks like what was once there, right? I mean, you're talking about trying to rebuild something that naturally took hundreds of years to create. So it's possible that you're restoring something that's not truly the exact same, but in all likelihood, it's going to help with improving biodiversity and stability in that area. Okay, so it's still going to be a beneficial thing. The last one I have, I think, for today is going to be about invasive, or what we call introduced species. And there are lots of examples of introduced species in lots of different environments. So we know for all of these species, these are things that have been brought to a new habitat where they don't naturally exist. And here in the Southeast, we have issues with something called kudzu, which is a type of plant that was brought over here from East Asia. I'm going to show you a video here in a second that outlines several different scenarios and examples of invasive species, but they all kind of share one thing in common, or a couple things. They're not native to that land. They have no true competitors or predators, and as a result of that, they really can threaten and wreak havoc on a very stable ecosystem. In all cases, they're usually brought here by humans, sometimes on purpose, but sometimes accidentally. Okay, and you'll see some examples of those here in just a second. But a lot of human trade and travel have resulted in issues with invasive species. And once they get to a new place, they kind of spread like wildfire, for lack of a better term. So kudzu has kind of taken over in the Southeast. We have zebra mussels up in the Great Lakes that were transferred over on these large shipping vessels that came over from Europe and other parts of the world. We have issues in Australia with certain types of invasive species that have come in and are just totally wiping out those native species in that area. What you're looking at a picture of here is in the Smoky Mountains. It's a consequence of an invasive bug called an emerald ash borer, or hemlock woody adelgid, I think is what we're looking at with this one. This is not acid rain. This is not due to a forest fire. This is due to an invasive species. And this is a bug, really an insect, that attacks trees. And over time, it kind of depletes the trees of resources and causes them to die because it burrows into the bark and the trees there. But you can think of probably, honestly, hundreds of different examples of these things that have been brought here, either, again, purposefully or unintentionally, but again, is really leading to a lot of issues because there are no natural predators, okay? So these things just grow and grow and grow. So yep, that was the end. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that video about invasive species. It's a TED Ed video, and I think it's a good one because it shows you some other examples of things that I haven't talked about here and gives you some more that you can think about in terms of trying to remember some of these concepts. All right. So that's it for 7.2. Finally, parts 1 and 2. Again, watch the video, and then if we have any other questions, we'll talk about them. But other than that, I will talk to y'all later. All right. Bye, y'all.
Massive vines that blanket the southern United States, climbing as high as 100 feet as they uproot trees and swallow buildings. A ravenous snake that is capable of devouring an alligator. Rabbit populations that eat themselves into starvation. These aren't horror movie concepts, they're real stories. But how could such situations exist in nature? All three are examples of invasive species. Organisms harmful not because of what they are, but where they happen to be. The kudzu vine, for example, had grown quietly in its native East Asia, eaten by various insects and dying off during the cold winters. But its fortunes changed when it was imported into the southeastern United States for porch decoration and cattle feed. Its planting was even subsidized by the government to fight soil erosion. With sunny fields, a mild climate, and no natural predators in its new home, the vine grew uncontrollably until it became known as the plant that ate the South. Meanwhile, in Florida's Everglades, Burmese pythons, thought to have been released by pet owners, are the cause of decreasing populations of organisms. They're successfully outcompeting top predators, such as the alligator and panther, causing a significant reduction in their food sources. They're not a problem in their native Asia because diseases, parasites, and predators help to control their population size. And in Australia, European rabbits eat so many plants that they wipe out the food supply for themselves and other herbivores. They're a pretty recent addition, intentionally introduced to the continent because one man enjoyed hunting them. Like the Burmese pythons, various factors in their native habitat keep their numbers in control. But in Australia, the lack of predators and a climate perfect for year-long reproduction allows their populations to skyrocket. So why does this keep happening? Most of the world's ecosystems are the result of millennia of coevolution by organisms, adapting to their environment and each other until a stable balance is reached. Healthy ecosystems maintain this balance via limiting factors, environmental conditions that restrict the size or range of a species. These include things like natural geography and climate, food availability, and the presence or absence of predators. For example, plant growth depends on levels of sunlight and soil nutrients. The amount of edible plants affects the population of herbivores, which in turn impacts the carnivores that feed on them. And a healthy predator population keeps the herbivores from becoming too numerous and devouring all the plants. But even minor changes in one factor can upset this balance, and the sudden introduction of non-native organisms can be a pretty major change. A species that is evolved in a separate habitat will be susceptible to different limiting factors, different predators, different energy sources, and different climates. If the new habitat's limiting factors fail to restrict the species' growth, it will continue to multiply, outcompeting native organisms for resources and disrupting the entire ecosystem. Species are sometimes introduced into new habitats through natural factors like storms, ocean currents, or climate shifts. The majority of invasive species, though, are introduced by humans. Often this happens unintentionally, as when the zebra mussel was accidentally brought to Lake Erie by cargo ships. But as people migrate around the world, we have also deliberately brought our plants and animals along, rarely considering the consequences. But now that we're learning more about the effects of invasive species on ecosystems, many governments closely monitor the transport of plants and animals and ban the imports of certain organisms. But could the species with the most drastic environmental impact be a group of primates who emerged from Africa to cover most of the world? Are we an invasive species?